All right, thanks for tuning in to this NHL trade deadline edition of Prime Sports Hockey, Prime Sports Radio Network. And this is East meets West. That means Rangers, Vancouver, and it was an eventful few days for our teams, Jan. Let's start with the New York Rangers, though, because Vancouver made their big deal before last week's show. Tyler Toffoli, he's already paying dividends. We'll talk about the Canucks in a little bit, but we'll start with the Rangers. And the good news, Chris Kreider will be around for quite a long time. And I'm sure when you heard the news, it made you real happy.
Yeah, it was an interesting day. I mean, as I wrote in my blog, you can definitely say that the gamut of emotions happened. You had the news come out that morning that the Rangers were calling a press conference, but no information was coming out in terms of what that conference was about. Would it be they were signing Kreider? Would it be that Kreider was being signed and being named the captain? Could it be that Henrik Lundqvist was being traded? Could it be that Henrik Lundqvist was retiring? Then there was one random tweet that came out from somebody that said Igor Shesterkin and Pavel Buchnevich were in a car accident, and Buk was shaken up, and Shesterkin had some rib injury, but that was not necessarily verified or confirmed by anybody. And then JD, President John Davidson, had his press conference at about 20 after 11 Eastern time that morning to verify that report that Shesterkin and Buchnevich were riding in Shesterkin's car in Brooklyn. Some car did an illegal U-turn and slammed into them. Buchnevich is banged up day to day with bumps and bruises. Shesterkin suffered a non-displaced rib fracture, which still sidelined him in at least 2 weeks. And then at the tail end of that press conference, JD slipped in that Chris Kreider signed a 7-year extension. So I was, in terms of the initial news, I mean, thank God, first of all, that both of them weren't hurt any more significant. And you and I both kind of remember probably unfortunate incident with Pelle Lindbergh, with him passing away in a car crash, some other accidents that's happened to people over the years. So thank God, first of all, the injuries aren't more significant, and then those injuries may have partially impacted the Rangers in terms of what they did at the deadline. The Kreider news is interesting because the day before I'd heard that the Rangers had offered 6 at about 6.5. The sticking point was a 7-year, and that was a huge sticking point. But the Rangers bent on the 7th year. They bent on a modified no trade clause initially, and no movement clause. The first 4 years, no trade clause. I think the next 2 years or so, or maybe I think it's 5 years, no movement, and 2 years, no trade. Half of that contract is in signing bonuses, so there's some cap play around there. I'm glad they locked him up. The expectation is he will be their captain, in my opinion, at least down the road. I understand the consternation over a 7-year deal for him, but if he provides substantive value for the first 4 or 5 years of the deal, you can kind of deal with the back end of the deal, mainly because, A, we know that Seattle's coming into the league in a couple of years, and we expect the cap to rise accordingly, and B, the contract with NBC is up in about another year. And when the broadcast networks may bid on the NHL, that may up the cap as well, as we've seen in other leagues. So
yeah, and let's hope ESPN or maybe FS1, somebody else comes in and steals it away from NBC.
And ESPN's been doing a bunch with their ESPN Plus. I mean, they have the daily show with Linda Cohn and Barry Melrose. They broadcast some games there. It's kind of interesting hybrid they're doing. They don't necessarily have it on the regular network because of NBC having it, but I do think there'll be other networks that get involved and maybe take pieces of the puzzle. And then the Rangers were rumored to be involved in other things, and there was some whispers about Brady Shea being on the block. And then Shea ended up going literally right at the deadline.
Yeah, I mean, for a first-round pick, that's a good deal for the Rangers, who have quality depth in the system. So, in all, you're able to sign your boy Kreider. You get a first-round pick. And what's the Berube deal about, by the way? That's just insurance in case you need that third goalie?
Yeah, well, the Berube deal is, one, to help him out in Hartford, because Hartford is actually in contention right now at the playoffs, and Hartford has been an abomination the last several years. And with Chris Knobloch taking over as coach this year and all the pipeline, team has become a much better pipeline. So a couple of things: one, depth; two, they moved Tom McCollum, who was there, and they got a better goalie than McCollum in with Shesterkin up in the majors, because Shesterkin had been their goalie for the first 3 quarters of the season to date until he was called up in January. It gives them a veteran presence there. It also gives them a guy that maybe they try to sign down the road for a 1 to 2 year deal to expose in the expansion draft. Is another possibility that's a little bit ways away, but more so is to give them depth and a real number one starting goalie in Hartford, which is jerking up in the NHL.
Well, 55 players involved in 32 deals, so it was an extremely busy day, trade deadline day, even though, and maybe because there were a few of the names that were traded before the deadline, like a Toffoli and so forth, maybe it didn't have the big names, though. There weren't all these blockbusters.
The cachet of the big name didn't go.
No. And so even though there were a lot of deals, it didn't really feel like it in my mind. You know, it was like, okay, there are a lot of deals, but I'm not sure it's going to impact a lot of teams. So.
No, agreed. I mean, I do think that there are teams that improved. I know when I had to write my RotoWire article this week, I got a call from the person who posted on Monday an email and said, hey, can you cover the trade deadline? I was like, I've already kind of written 95% of my article, but I can update it. But there wasn't a lot of players, in my opinion, whose value substantively changed in the deal, and that's because of the way the deadline kind of worked. I mean, there are players that did better. There are teams, I think, that did well. So, you know, if you look at teams that did well,
first of all, let's talk about the Islanders, because the Rangers had a big win. First of all, the Rangers had a big win against the Islanders last night, and Pageau played his first game. I guess we'll start first of all with we talked about Green, I think, last week, right? The move.
We did. We touched on Green, and we thought it was a nice little acquisition, though. He left yesterday's game injured, and there's no real news in terms of the update.
Yeah, he's banged up a little bit. But what'd you think about Pageau? It's a career year. They give up big-time picks for him. Then, of course, they sign him long-term. If you're an Islander fan, are you happy about this?
Well, first of all, it lengthens their lineup, right? So it gives them a real good third-line center to go with, Barzal, who we know is a clear number one, and Nelson's had a real resurgence of a season this year. So it clearly lengthens their lineup. He's a guy they'll use on the second-line power play. As we saw last night, he definitely has skill. The goal was a little bit of a lucky goal, but he's increased his shooting percentage this year in terms of the type of season he had in Ottawa. Lamoriello was probably only going to give up the first rounder if he had a real strong sense that he was able to re-sign him long term. And I guess his view is we're going to probably hopefully finish in the playoffs. We're going to have a high draft pick this year, meaning lower down in the first round. I get a guy who I've locked up now for, I wouldn't say a cheap rate, but $35 million a year is not an overly ridiculous price for a guy like Pageau, despite the season he's having. And let me phrase that, even with the season he's having. So as you said, part of it has to be discounted because of the shooting percentage. But he clearly is a guy who is now shown he can be a decent goal scorer in the league. He will be a very solid third-line center on that team. There was questions in terms of whether or not Lamoriello would really give the team an opportunity to win. He's now done that. There was other whispers and rumors that in a deal that may happen this offseason that he was trying to reacquire or reunite, is a better phrase, with Zach Parise, who played for him in New Jersey, right? And there was Andrew Ladd waived his no movement clause, and Parise waived his no movement clause, and the problem is trying to get the cap to work out based upon the remaining contract, and especially if Parise retired in those 5 years, that cap recapture hit for the Islanders might have been huge. So that's something I think they may revisit this offseason, given the conversations that they had to date. But the Islanders getting Green and Pageau definitely impacted them positively based upon the lineup and the impact of that lineup and lengthening the lineup in terms of what they could potentially do to try to make a run this postseason.
So you're happy if you're an Islander fan.
Yes, okay. I'm definitely happy. You would have liked to have seen maybe another scoring winger because you and I both talked that their second line or their subsequent scoring other than the first line has been a bit questionable. But you've gotten good years out of Nelson and Bouvier. And Lee's been up and down, but you know what, he can get streaky and get hot. You know what Barzal can do. So they've now added another scoring center that augments what they have in place, which is something they clearly needed.
As far as the game, Rangers had the game in hand 3-1. They get the power play, and then as soon as they get the power play with 7 minutes to go, they did everything they possibly could to lose that game. They had, I forget who it was who took the penalty to take them off the power play, which is just the biggest.
Strome.
Ryan Strome. Cannot do that. That was a free 2 minutes to waste when you're up 2. That's just ridiculous. Then you get the other penalty 2 minutes later, 3 minutes later to put them back on the power play, and then you knew. I'm watching this, and I'm sure you probably had the same feeling. I'm watching this last-minute barrage, and I'm saying they have got to clear the puck once. If they can get the puck out once, the game's over. If they don't get the puck out once, they might be scored upon here. And it's not usually you feel that way because empty nets happen all the time. But you just had the feeling that what was going on there, the Rangers were in deep trouble. And they gave up the goal late.
Absolutely. Look, first give the Islanders some credit because they upped their game, especially in the third period. And it was a very, I wouldn't say it was a well-officiated game, right? So you had the overturned goal on Lee for being in the crease and making and goaltender's interference. That was a pretty lousy call. You had the Jacob Trouba where they gave Pajot 10 minutes additional as a misconduct, as a game misconduct, which was also kind of a ridiculous call. You had the goal that Pajot scored that hit the stanchions behind the glass behind the net and rebounded in an odd manner.
Yeah.
So overall, just a weird game, but that's what happens at the Coliseum. And, you know, Rangers Islanders, just like any good divisional rivalry, anything can happen and will happen. And I expected the Islanders to make a push, especially when Strome took what we in New York call the Benoit Pouliot, or the offensive zone penalty. They ended up, he basically got, as we call it, the jack in the box, right? So everybody forgot Eberle coming out of the box. And he came right down the middle of the slot, and he found them in a backhand goal, and it's 3-2, and all of a sudden the Rangers are now on their heels, despite giving up a goal. But as a Ranger fan, the ending was tremendous. Panarin steals the puck from Bouvier at the blue line, comes on the ice and gets cornered by three guys, and somehow miraculously gets the puck over to Zibanejad, who blasts an absolute howitzer past Semyon Varlamov for his 29th of the year and the game winner. And the Rangers do get the extra point. The Islanders get a fortunate 1 point.
Yeah, that was the thing.
So
Rangers
happy,
needed, after what happened, to go into overtime, they desperately needed to get that extra point, because if they would have lost that point, that would, I mean, even I think now, today, they have to feel a little bit, we shouldn't have given up that extra point to the Islanders, because that's the team you're chasing. But at least they salvaged the two, because there's more teams to chase other than the Islanders.
Absolutely. Good game, fun game. Last meeting of the season between the two of them. Alexander Georgiev was very good. He's actually going to start again on Friday night against Montreal, which isn't a surprise. The big question will be, does Henrik Lundqvist get the nod on the road against Philly on Saturday?
Yeah, the Montreal game is a must-win the way the Rangers are playing right now. By the way, a franchise record for consecutive road wins. That is something else. And that Flyer game Saturday, right?
Flyers game is Saturday. Montreal is Friday.
So that is a big game also. These are big games, and the Rangers have now put themselves in a position that a couple of weeks ago they were probably in with about 10 other teams in the NHL, where you're like 10, 12 points out. Maybe you could put, if you put a string of wins together, you're back into it, but only usually one team does it. And right now it's the Rangers. The Rangers are the hottest team in the NHL right now outside the playoffs trying to get in.
No question. But as you've mentioned, right, it's a logjam of teams. There are a lot of other teams in the East that did particularly well, just kind of quick hitters. Pittsburgh did very well, getting Jason Zucker, we talked about a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, how many deals did they make? Like 12?
So they got Connor Sheary back. They get Evan Rodriguez back. They made a lot of good deals. Washington, we talked about getting Brent.
Well, what about Marleau? Is Marleau more of just
So Marleau is got some speed still left. He can be a third line and second line power play guy. They didn't give up a ton in giving up a third round pick for him. They brought in depth in terms of at forward, which is something that they needed, and they go from there.
I was surprised San Jose didn't try to throw Joe Thornton a bone.
San Jose, the rumor is that San Jose was sticking to that they wanted a third round pick. I believe they were offered a fourth, maybe even a fifth, and the rumor is Doug Wilson refused to bend, which,
That's
as you
terrible.
saw from Thornton's comments, he wasn't happy about it because he's given his all to that organization. Yep. There's a strong likelihood he may retire after the season, or he could have come back there. There was no reason not to send him there to get even getting a middling return for a guy who's really going to do absolutely nothing for your team this year because of the position you're in and what he's meant for the organization is a very bad move, in my opinion, by Wilson.
Yeah, and chances are that's the type of move that may mean the Sharks will be looking for a new GM next year.
It's possible. Although I do like what San Jose did in terms of other trades that they made at the deadline. I thought getting a third for Marleau was a nice move. I like some of the other trades that they made at the deadline also, but not making that move, in my opinion, was an epic fail.
All right, so Pittsburgh gets Marleau and Zucker, the bigger names. Of course, Zucker's the big one we talked about a few weeks ago. Sticking in the East, Washington, now Kovalchuk, who seemed reborn with the Canadians. And Washington knows this is a rental. Chances are Kovalchuk's going to re-sign with Montreal. He really seemed to like it there. But this is an opportunity to win a Stanley Cup. So I got to imagine now you got to play with some really top-notch snipers as your teammates. If Kovalchuk can keep playing like that, this could be a nice move for Washington.
Good move for Washington. Gives him depth. Gives him another power play guy who's not going to see a ton of time because he plays the same side as Ovechkin does. And congrats to Alexander Ovechkin on getting his 700th goal this past week. A tremendous accomplishment. But to me, from a fantasy value perspective, we're going that route. Kovalchuk's value declined a little bit because in Montreal he's getting a ton of ice time. But GM Marc Bergevin did a very nice job at the deadline, turning assets into picks. He could have probably moved Thomas Tatar and Jeff Petrie, but decided against it. Kovalchuk does give Washington another weapon in case they need it. Like I said, a third-line guy, second-line power play guy. If you think about it, they got a third-round pick for a guy they brought in for absolutely nothing and turned him into a third-round pick, which is probably what drove a little bit what Doug Wilson thought he can get for Thornton. So that may have set the marketplace, which impacted his desire or ability or willingness to deal Joe Thornton. But a nice job by Washington, and you add in Brendan Dillon, who, as we talked about last week, gives them another physical blue liner, which lengthens their blue line and makes them a lot tougher to play against.
Now, Boston, tell me a little bit about this player that they gave up first-round draft pick. They were able to unload David Backes' contract, also gave a defenseman to Anaheim. So talk. This particular player also has a little bit – doesn't he have like an injury history as well?
Ondrej Kase's got a fairly significant injury history. He's injured again. He's dealing with an illness right now, a guy who's had a little bit of a checkered career in terms of injuries, a third-line player. Decent guy to get because especially he's got another year of his contract at $2.6 million. They gave up, as you said, a prospect in Axelson, a first-rounder in Backes, although they're only eating a quarter of Backes' salary. I really thought Anaheim probably should have gotten a little bit more, but Axelson is a decent prospect who probably will make that team as a third-pair defenseman down the road. I like what Boston did also by moving Danton Heinen, who I didn't think was a tremendous player there, for a guy with a little bit more upside in Nick Ritchie, who fits what Boston does well. Boston, unfortunately, they didn't get the big name. They were rumored to be in on Kreider and a couple of other bigger names, but Toffoli, right? But they didn't. But they got Kosh, who helps their team. They got Ritchie, who helps their team. Now Rask has hit a little bit of a bobble. He needs to start playing better again, and Halak's had a little bit of a tough time lately. But Boston has improved their team, although right now the way Tampa's playing and what Tampa did at the deadline, adding Blake Coleman for a first-rounder, getting Barclay Goodrow for a first-rounder.
What are they doing, though, giving up a first-round draft pick for Goodrow?
So here's the rationale. Brisebois' viewpoint is, look, we have a relatively short window of opportunity, and we have to revamp this lineup based upon salaries down the road. We've added two guys who are third-line players, both of whom can play up in the second line, and the guy in Coleman who's got one of the top 5 goal-scoring ratios, 5x5 in the league, and a guy who can play the penalty kill. Same with Goodrow, who stepped up to the first line for a little bit when Couture is hurt. So guys who can move up and down the lineup for $2.7 million next year. And a team that's dealing with cap issues to get 2 top 9 guys for that little amount is a pretty nice return. And his viewpoint is, I'm going to be picking 31st or 32nd or in the top 20s this year in terms of my draft pick. I'm not worried about 5 years down the road. I need to worry about the here and now. And given what happened in the playoffs with us bowing out to Columbus last year, I need to make moves to make sure that doesn't happen. We have a shot to make a run in the Stanley Cup Finals.
Talk about Carolina because they're trying to make a move to get in. They're ahead of the Rangers right now. They had the freak occurrence on Saturday in Toronto with both of their goalies going down. They make the deal for Vatanen. They make the deal we talked about with the Rangers. They also make the deal with the Florida Panthers. That surprised some people that the Panthers gave up on Trocheck to a team that they're competing with, of course, for that playoff spot. And it seems to me that Carolina did pretty well under the circumstances. What's the situation as well with those goalies and how quickly they're going to be able to get either one of them back?
So a couple of things. So let me talk Florida quickly first. The Trocheck move. Trocheck hasn't been the same since his ankle injury, but he's still a guy who's a second or third line center, depending on the team. The whispers out of Florida is Florida needs to cut another $10 million in salary next year. And I don't know I'm not sure what Vince Viola is doing in terms of the owner, but they're moving into a new practice facility. I know that the fan base down there is apathetic at best, and they all root for the opponents based upon who comes down, because based upon the population of Florida. But for them to have to cut $10 million, don't be surprised if you hear lots of whispers of teams making calls on Alexander Barkov next year to try to pull him away from Florida because they have to cut salary. But in terms of Carolina, the crazy issue of the backup emergency goaltender, Marley's backup emergency goaltender, stoning his Toronto team to get the win is a great story. Granted, not an ideal look for the NHL because you'd like to have better contingencies in place, but just as a human interest story, a really fun human interest story. But they lost Reimer. They lost Mrazek. Mrazek is supposedly dealing with a concussion issue. Reimer may be out for a while, they say, with his injury. They called up the two goaltenders out of Charlotte, Nezelik, who's probably going to be their number one for a bit. And we'll come back to the goalies in a minute. But in terms of, they got Vatanen, in my opinion, for a fairly cheap rate because there's, we don't know how long he's going to be out. There's some whispers that he's actually healthier than people have been reported, that he was just waiting to get dealt out of New Jersey. If he can be healthy, he really lengthens their and improves their defense. Shea yesterday played on the top line with Slavin, and anytime you play with Slavin, your numbers will go up. And they're amazingly deep on defense. And what happens if Dougie Hamilton comes back at the end of the year? You're looking at a pretty stout 1-6 and maybe even a 1-8 on defense. But to me, what I find is the fail that they did was not getting Robin Lehner.
Yeah.
Las Vegas getting Lehner to help with Marc-Andre Fleury, who struggled a little bit this year. Lehner hasn't been great in Chicago, but he's going to be rejuvenated in a cup race. He could end up being the number one in Vegas if Fleury has issues, and he's a pretty good 1A or 1B interview. He would have been clearly the number one in Charlotte, in Carolina, if he went there. And given the cost where they gave up a second and a middling prospect, to me, if I'm Carolina and I was making that move, that would have been the move I would have been all over. So while I like they improved their defense and like what they've done there, to me, not getting Lehner, especially given the injuries to Mrazek and Reimer this weekend, is a pretty bad move in terms of their organization.
You have to believe that these injuries are not going to be that long, because otherwise, why are you even making any of these other deals? I mean, unless they really like these young goalies.
If you have a good 1-6, right, you can hopefully take some of the pressure off of your goalie. But I do agree with you. My opinion, like I said, is I would have gone after Lehner. That would have been the guy I would have went after, and especially if Chicago was going to move him and the potential upside and the cost associated with it. That's the guy I would have gone after.
But that's why you have to think that they just believe in. Well, we'll see. Maybe by next week's show, both goalies will be back. Who knows?
Look this way. Toronto could have made other moves. They didn't really make any moves defensively.
And Jake Muzzin, who
just came back and signed
a long-term deal,
broke his hand and is out a month.
That is crazy.
Depth was you
nice
and I
timing.
You and I have discussed a lot, right? The Stanley Cup playoffs are a battle of attrition.
Oh, yeah.
It's not always the best team that wins. It's the team that sometimes is the healthiest that ends up winning because you lose key players and you don't have guys to replace them. That's where you end up getting burnt.
All right, now we were talking about Vegas as we switch over to actually one more in the East, Columbus, before we go and talk about the Western Conference because their injury situation this week just continues to pile up. Atkinson's still out. Jones, of course, out for a while. Bjorkstrand is now out for a couple of months, and they also lose Elvis for a little bit.
Yep.
So, wow. And they're sitting there right now in the playoffs. So, once again, if you're on the outside looking in, you're like the New York Rangers. You're feeling pretty good.
The term right now is the key term for Columbus. I mean, the amount of injuries that team has had has been staggering. John Tortorella is doing it with spit and baling wire right now, but there's only so long you can withstand those injuries. And now losing Bjorkstrand and especially losing Elvis, unfortunately, I think their shot at the playoffs is done. But I'm not necessarily going to 100% rule them out because Tortorella has found a way to win with less all season long.
All right. In the West, you mentioned Vegas already. We talked about Martinez going to Vegas, which was a big move. He's already looking good there. And then they get Lehner. So that should be a huge lift. This is basically an insurance policy in case Fleury doesn't have it once the playoffs begin.
Absolutely. Or down the stretch, they get a better backup to Subban and a guy who can step in for Fleury if need be.
Also in the Western Conference, take a look at some of the deals. Edmonton, they made a few deals. They get Mike Green. They also wind up getting the forward from Detroit and Ennis from Ottawa.
Tyler Ennis. So Andreas Athanasiou gives them a ton of speed, a guy who's a defensive, liability, but he's got a ton of speed. You put him on the top six, or maybe with McDavid as he did yesterday, and you saw what they did. Ennis scored yesterday. I really, Mike Green gives them an offensive defenseman that doesn't help their defensive blue line, but they'll probably deploy him in offensive zone starts, and especially on the power play. I really like what Edmonton did. They needed some supplementary scoring. Yamamoto, though, is banged up a little bit, but if he's back, you look at with Nugent Hopkins, the way he's played. McDavid's back now. We know what Draisaitl's done. You got Athanasiou. You got Ennis. You got Green on your blue line. You got Mike Smith playing well between the pipes. I mean, to me, out in the Pacific, they all of a sudden may end up becoming the team to beat, or Vegas. But they did. I like what they did at the deadline.
I still look, especially with Klefbom out, I look at this and I'm like, yeah, but all the moves they made are still more offensive moves. And that's okay. They don't have that stellar goalie. They don't have those Norris defenders. So why not play like Las Vegas and just or Pittsburgh, overpower your opponent on offense? And they're going to be exciting to watch in the postseason, that's for sure.
And Klefbom hopefully should be back in a couple of weeks, and they now have a shot to withstand his absence.
All right. Also, Gustafsson, what does that do for Calgary? Because he's an offensive defenseman, isn't he?
Offensive defenseman had a great year last year, slumped this year, probably more regression back to the norm. Gives them a wild card flyer that potentially can be a boom or a bust guy and helps them potentially on their second unit power play.
All right. And by the way, Taylor Hall, what's the deal with Taylor Hall? Is he just one of those players you don't want on your team?
We'll see what happens. I mean, I do think Arizona, now that Kemper's back, I'm not ruling them out. I think Ranta's been back and played fairly well.
They are
well
running out of games. They just don't have enough games.
Yep. We'll see. If they get on another hot streak, they got a shot. But I agree with you. Yes, it's starting to get, as the expression goes, late early in terms of making a run with less than 20 games left.
Also, as far as injuries, as far as the Western Conference is concerned, what a big week for Nashville. They get Ryan Ellis back, and they are back in the playoffs as of today. So Nashville, after looking really lost for most of the season, they're right back in it.
Yeah, I mean, look, I personally don't think Nashville did enough at the deadline. They obviously didn't do anything at the deadline, really. I really wasn't happy with David Poyle did. I thought he should have made some more moves, especially knowing you're going to get Ellis back. But he does clearly bring a huge component that was missing to that team right now. But I do think they still needed some more help up front. And to me, that would have been the move I would have made. I mean, you look at the Granlund-Fiala trade. Kevin Fiala has been awfully good in Minnesota. You wonder if he could have done the same thing in Nashville.
All right, now Vancouver, they lose Markstrom for a few weeks. Good timing that they lose him before the trade deadline so they can make the deal for the Devils back up. But this is Thatcher Demko time. Worst timing for Markstrom, too, when he's trying to get that big contract. People laughed when he said the reason he came back in to the game against Boston was because he didn't want to lose his job. They might have laughed, but I'm not so sure Markstrom was kidding, because you know how it is. I mean, he knows he's better than Demko right now, but if Demko plays well enough and Vancouver wins with him, Vancouver's got all the leverage in the world contractually, and if Markstrom really wants to stay there, that's going to benefit Vancouver as far as the salary cap.
Absolutely. I mean, it's clearly not the best timing for Markstrom as well. Demko, though, gets potentially the benefit, and Domingue steps into a situation where he goes from outhouse to penthouse. And while they're not necessarily an elite team, he has a shot to actually make a difference for Vancouver and make playoffs.
Yeah, we'll see exactly. And Ian Clark is an excellent goalie coach for Vancouver, so maybe he can change his career as a backup, and who knows. Also, they get good news that Brock Besser now may return before the playoffs, which is a reason why they decided or couldn't make another move for another depth forward, because they just didn't have the cap room. They had to keep Besser on the books. So that's good news, though.
Agreed.
That Besser might, because Toffoli's fitting in perfectly.
For Vancouver, agreed.
All right, now let's get to futures. So after the deadline, we now take a look at the futures. And what do you think about Boston and Tampa at 5-1? Because they're kind of low, but it all depends.
Well, one of them is going to knock the other one out.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So it's not like both of them could most probably make it to the Western Conference Finals, right? So the Eastern Conference Finals. So you're hedging your bet on which one it's going to be, because only one of them could be there. And that limits your opportunities associated with the odds you're going to get.
And did you think either team outdid the other at the deadline, where you say, I kind of.
I like what Tampa did probably slightly more than Boston did, solely because of the guys they brought in terms of the two guys they brought in. I don't mind Koch and I don't mind the Richie trade, but I do think getting Goodrow and also getting Blake Coleman gave Tampa a slight edge at the deadline.
All right, this is what I did. I went with both Boston and Tampa. I put 1,000 on Boston, 500 on Tampa. So I've got 26,000 on Boston now, 17.5 on Tampa. I also put 1,000 on Pittsburgh. I got to put money on Pittsburgh at 9-1 with all the moves they're making. Vegas, I put 500 on Vegas at 10-1. They are starting to drop, and I also decided to put a 300 more on Philly. After they were 30-1 last week, they're now 18-1. So now I have 20,000 on Philly. Not sure I'm going to do anything else, but those are the 5 I'm definitely going to do. What about you?
So this week I'm going with you. Pittsburgh, same thing. I'm putting 1,000 on Pittsburgh. Vegas at 10-1. I put 1,000 on Vegas. I'm actually taking your Canucks. I'm putting 1,000 on your Canucks as well. At I believe 18-1, and those are the moves I'm making this week.
All right, and just taking. You see, I can't touch Colorado with all the injuries. I'm surprised they're still 9-1. St. Louis is tough to go with, even though you already have them, because repeating, and they didn't have anything to do because they're still waiting for 2 guys to come back, and we haven't had an update on either one, right? Tarasenko and
Tarasenko is supposedly going to be back before the end of the year. We just don't know when Tarasenko is going to be back. I don't think Boumister's back at all this year.
And Washington, that was the one team I already have 25,000 on Washington, but they might be a bargain at 9-1, sort of like Pittsburgh.
Correct. Agreed. But same type thing. Both teams may knock each other out in the first round of the playoffs, depending on where they land.
And neither of us have taken Edmonton yet at 15-1. See, I just don't think Edmonton has what it takes to win a cup with that defense.
I debated it, but yeah, I'm a little wary. But I was debating it this week as well.
And any other teams that were in the far reaches, Edmonton, Islanders, those teams.
Debated the Islanders a little bit, but decided against it because I just don't know if they have the horses to get through the
And
East.
Nashville,
especially if you got to go through Pittsburgh and Washington. I don't know if they have enough offensive firepower. That was my debate with Nashville. They didn't really augment their offense, which to me is their weakness.
All right, that'll wrap it up, Jan. I appreciate it. And you're going to, what do you have this week at RotoWire and the Rangers blog?
RotoWire's column this week. I touched on the teams I thought did well and did poorly, as well as a handful of players. There weren't a lot of players that I think were impacted by the deadline. And at Hockey Buzz, a lot of Rangers articles, including a fairly massive trade recap and viewpoint that I posted yesterday morning.
Appreciate it, Jan. We'll talk to you next week.
Sounds good.